Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here tonight. I can't thank you enough for turning out in such numbers. July is usually a quiet time in Accra, but it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and new ones too. I would especially like to thank and welcome the Mellon Foundation Humanities in Place team and their colleagues. It is especially meaningful to welcome you to the AFI tonight, since we wouldn't be here without your support. On that note, I would like to thank all our supporters, AJ Associates, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ford Foundation, PRISM, and of course Mellon. This will be the last AFI lecture for some time, partly because I desperately need to take a break, but also because the landscape in terms of built environment education around us has changed, not only in Africa, but across the globe. What I imagined 3 years ago when I began the AFI has been profoundly changed by two things. One, the very real challenges of building and sustaining an institute, and two, the almost simultaneous appointment as curator of the Architecture Biennale in Venice. I have been critical of institutions for most of my working life. After the experiences of the last 18 months, it occurs to me that perhaps building another institution is not the right way to go. I also want to thank everyone in the audience and those who will watch this online for your dedication, support, and friendship. You've been coming to events week after week, month after month, year in, year out. You've been patient when we've had to take a break to concentrate on the Biennale or research, and you have been patient as my focus has inevitably slipped. Those of you who could make it to Venice came, and it was one of the most meaningful moments of my life to see you there. You have been the best audience a startup institute could hope for. I don't know where the AFI will go next, but I'm sure wherever we do go, you will follow. 2 years ago, the AFI was in its infancy with a minuscule budget, a cleaner, and a driver. I had to build 3 teams simultaneously from scratch: administrators, curatorial assistants, and researchers. Over the course of the next year, with support from Ford and AJ Associates, we met in Accra, London, Edinburgh, Dublin, and Venice. Through workshops, discussions, Zoom, and Dropbox, the narrative and design of the exhibition emerged. I want to especially thank my Accra team, some of whom are here tonight, others on holiday, Kofi Abankwa, Ernest Donko, and Kwabna Akosa, who managed payments, particularly to all the participants, ensuring that funds got to the right people at the right time in order to make it all happen. Sarah Asafoaje, Ruth Kwakwa, and Anthony Wartsam, who is here tonight, organized the logistics and hospitality for the 500-plus guests who descended on Venice for the pre-opening. I'd like to thank Martin Mensah, Ruben Atekpe, Victor Saki, Patrick Atta, and Sean Hardcastle for their strategic input, and Patrick Gentilezza, who has been the most supportive and attentive landlord one could hope for over the past 2 years. Mawuli Afatsiawo and his team have recorded all our lectures, which are available free on our website and YouTube. And Festus Jackson Davis, our AFI staff photographer who's roaming around, whose work featured in the exhibition in Venice, as well as throughout the catalogue. This team, together with the curatorial team based in Dublin and the research team based in Africa and Europe, are the glue that held the exhibition together. However, not all teams are equal, as I found out. 3 of the Accra-based team were denied visas by the Italian embassy in Accra, citing doubts as to their intention to return to Accra. I would like to thank Ernest, Anthony, and Festus for their grace and fortitude in handling a difficult and sometimes distressing situation. The irony of a show in Europe about Africa that closes its doors to Africans is not lost on me. I'm aware that there are those who think it serves us right. Who did we think we were? Who did we think, or how did we think we would be treated differently? But I also believe in the power of culture to change mindsets, both at home and abroad. The exhibition is a portal, a gate, a pathway, a channel. It places a non-European perspective at the heart of its story, but it does not do so by overwriting the existing narrative. The story of architecture is not wrong, it is incomplete. The Laboratory of the Future tries to show that it is possible to speak from a place of invitation, not exclusion, and that the invitation to expand our minds, ideas, and perspectives enriches rather than diminishes us all. I cannot say it often enough. The inclusion of other voices is not only a moral or political imperative, but also a deeply creative one. It changes the way we see the world, it deepens our understanding, it adds to scholarship, it does not detract from it. One of the most important categories in the exhibition belongs to the 22 emerging practitioners, the so-called guests from the future. I was always a little uneasy about the title. The word guest implies a host, and I was unsure about the power connotations of what it means to be a guest rather than a host. But I came across another reading of the word guest, which I would like to share with you. Jacques Derrida is a French philosopher born in Algeria into a French Jewish family. He is best known in architectural circles for his work on the structure of language. I cannot pretend to fully grasp the philosophical brilliance of his work, but I love its playfulness, its refusal to accept that meaning is always fixed and eternal. The short video that I'm about to play looks at two words for future, the word future in French, le futur et l'avenir. One, le futur, which comes from Latin, and the other, l'avenir, which comes from Catalan or Old French, meaning to come about, to arrive. Both mean the future, but in different ways.
En général, j'essaie de distinguer entre le futur et l'avenir. Le futur, c'est ce qui, demain, tout à l'heure, le siècle prochain, deviendra, ce qui est deviendra. Donc, il y a le futur des programmes, le futur prévisible, predictable, programs, prescriptions, tout ce qui, en quelque sorte, peut être scheduled, donc prévu. Et l'avenir, je préfère le mot avenir, to come, parce que ça se réfère à quelqu'un qui vient, à ce qui vient et qui, venant, arrivant, n'est pas prévisible. Et pour moi, c'est ça, le vrai futur, qui est unpredictable. Et l'autre qui vient sans que je puisse même l'attendre, d'une certaine manière, sans que je puisse m'y attendre. Donc s'il y a du vrai futur au-delà du futur, c'est l'avenir en tant qu'il est la venue de l'autre là où je ne peux pas le prévoir.
I want to say something about languages that have more than one root.
Also, my reading in English. I find English far finer language than Spanish.
Why?
Well, there are many reasons. Firstly, English is both a Germanic and a Latin language. It has those two registers. For example, for any idea you take, you have two words. Those words do not mean exactly the same. For example, if I say regal, they're not exactly the same thing as saying kingly. But if I say fraternal, it's not the same as saying brotherly, or dark and obscure. Those words are different. It will make all the difference, speaking, for example, of the Holy Spirit, it will make all the difference in the word in the poem if I wrote about the Holy Spirit, not about the Holy Ghost. Since ghost is a fine, dark Saxon word, while spirit is a Latin word. Well, and then there is another reason. The reason is that I think that of all languages, English is the most physical of all languages.
The most what?
Physical.
Mm-hmm.
For example, he loomed over. You can't very well say that in Spanish.
Asomó?
No, but not exactly the same. And then then in English you can do almost anything with verbs and prepositions. For example, to laugh off, to dream away. Those things can't be said in Spanish. To live down something, to live up to something. You can't say those things in Spanish. They can't be said, or in the Romance language.
The speaker is the legendary Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges, considered to be one of the finest writers of Spanish language literature. I am drawn to his description of a language that has two registers. For me, architecture is a profound act of translation. We translate an idea into a drawing into a model into a building, and so on. It is a language of sorts which we learn to recognize, draw, speak, build, and occupy. I don't think there is an African alive who does not speak more than one language. We live in a world that has two registers, not within the same language, but between languages, and moreover, between languages that have absolutely nothing to do with one another. The ability to switch between Twi and English, or Wolof and French, or Kimbundu and Portuguese is a condition that is very specific to this continent, no other. The same applies to the diaspora, where the condition is as much about language as it is about navigating two different, often contradictory realities. This aspect of being both here and there has a profound impact on our imaginations and the way we see the world. I want to emphasize that it is not only Africans who live in this space and in this way. It is true of almost anyone living outside the centers of power or in multiple cultures. But until relatively recently in architecture, this fluidity and ambiguity of identity was seen as a drawback, an impediment to fully mastering and understanding the canon. No longer. If there is anything I hope audiences take away from the Biennale, it is that this condition of both and, of seeing and being seen simultaneously, of moving almost seamlessly between paradigms, is an asset to architecture, not an obstacle. This is a talk in 7 parts, some very short, some a little longer, that attempts to paint as accurate a picture as possible of the events of the past 18 months, leading up to the opening of the first ever Africa-focused international architecture exhibition, which has been described as groundbreaking by some and a downright failure by others. Well, one person anyway. Fortunately, there are more of the former reviews than the latter. I will be using a mixture of photographs and videos throughout, with about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. You can ask me anything, but I should also say that the Biennale College ended last Saturday. Over the past month, I have been dealing with 49 students, 15 tutors, 8 filmmakers, and I am extremely tired. So my answers may lack a certain dynamic quality.
Hello, I'm Mawuli Afatsiawo, a practicing architect in Ghana with a future aspiration of pursuing higher education in architecture and urban planning. Participating in this year's Biennale College Architectural Program would enable me to understand the changing trends in architecture education over the past couple of years. I would also get clear insights on the issues of decolonization and decarbonization and their impact on future practitioners and educators. As a future researcher and educator myself, I believe this opportunity will enable me to get expert knowledge and skills on the issues of climate crisis and also learn from the diverse perspective of globally renowned researchers, practitioners, educators, and policymakers. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
So Selom has just completed 1 month at the Biennale College. She was an absolute delight. I'm not sure if she's here this evening, but if she is, thank you, Selom. Plenty of architecture. For over 120 years, La Biennale di Venezia has been one of the most prestigious cultural institutions in the world. Established in 1895, last year nearly 1 million visitors came to the art exhibition. In the 1930s, music, cinema, and theatre joined art, and in 1980, the first international architecture exhibition took place. This year's 18th International Architecture Exhibition is entitled The Laboratory of the Future, a shortened version of the longer title, Africa is the Laboratory of the Future. And it opened just over 2 months ago, on the 20th of May, with 7,500 visitors on its first day and nearly 13,000 accredited visitors in the pre-opening days known as the Vernissage. I would like to quote something that I said at the press conference of 18th May. It comes from a letter I wrote to the 3 teams that make up the AFI and the Biennale. I wrote it in April 2022, with just over a year to go to the opening. Dear team, there are many ways to start a creative project. Sometimes it begins with an idea, a kernel of truth that the author hatches in the wee hours of the morning, when the rest of the world is asleep and the mind wanders easily, fluidly, or the other way around. The idea grows, acquiring depth and weight, until it is formed enough to be shared. At other times, an idea or a concept appears fully formed, usually born out of the conversations that preceded it. Occasionally, however, it is not ignited by a single spark, but is rather the crystallization of many ideas whose provenance can be traced back over years, sometimes decades. This letter is addressed to the teams of dispersed people who make up both the AFI and the Biennale. It is akin to a manifesto, but written in a different key. Think of it as a love letter, a passionate description of the task that lies ahead. It is both personal and public. It is for you, but it is also about and of you. It was written in one place, in one go, but I have been writing this all my life. apparently the most difficult dance in the world.
The people by simply looking at them for just a minute, looking
In line with our ambition to do things differently, both in terms of participants and environmental impact, this exhibition had two major departures from tradition. One, we decided not to rebuild a new exhibition, but rather to adaptively reuse the framework we inherited from the curator of the previous Art Biennale. Second, we asked participants to touch the Cordery and Central Pavilion, the main spaces, as lightly as possible. Although certainly not carbon-free, the use of screens, films, projections, and drawings in place of models and artifacts wherever possible sets a different tone. We are well aware of the need to quantify one's efforts statistically with hard numbers instead of warm and vague aims, but we recognize too that changes must also be cultural, that the culture of architectural exhibitions must change. Those changes had to happen on both sides, participants and audience. So much has already been written about the expectation that this Biennale will change everything simply by virtue of having more Black and African participants than previous exhibitions. But this misses the point. For difference, however you construct it, to make a difference, it has to do more. It cannot simply be. The invitation to participants was therefore threefold. One, bring yourselves, your authentic selves, free of expectations, masks, and assumptions. And if you will indulge me for a moment, I want to say something about the tension between the exploration of an idea and its explanation, which is a burden that all Black creatives share, especially when exhibiting work outside their own context. To explain what you're doing and why, at the same time that you are exploring it, is almost impossible. To have the freedom to explore without having to explain yourself is one of the great gifts of any creative endeavor. In a European context such as the Biennale, if you are Black, you almost always have to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, what it means, what it might mean, what it did mean, why it's relevant, how to read it, how to interpret it, what its significance is, and on and on. This work, and it is work, of explanation is a distraction. It was very important to me that the practitioners I selected were as free of this burden as possible. 2, participants were asked to frame their work in terms of the two guiding principles, decolonization and decarbonization, which, as I have always said, are two sides of the same coin. The Black body was Europe's first unit of energy, of labor. There is a long historical relationship between race and exploitation, whether of the human or the environment. 3, think deeply and carefully about your choice of representation. Unlike artists, architects who are invited to take part in exhibitions make work largely to represent something that exists out there beyond the gallery in the so-called real world. In her review of the Biennale Arquitectura 2021, the Spanish architect and academic Marina Otero comments, "The Giardini, which is one of the locations, is a park where global geopolitics and colonial and imperial histories are enacted. At the core of its experience are nationalism and the politics of representation, mediated by the resources that each nation can fuel into this exhibition act. Unevenly distributed resources mirror global conditions. The differences noticeable amongst those who have access to this national showroom heighten when considering those unable to take part." Otero's review concentrated on the national pavilions, but the question of resources spreads much further and wider. Participation in all aspects of the Biennale, including the exhibition, is predicated on two things: imagination and the means to display it. For the majority of the participants across all parts of the exhibition, there was plenty of one and precious little of the other. A publicly taxpayer-funded entity such as La Biennale di Venezia cannot be expected to fund participants' work. The cost must be borne by the participants, either through private or institutional means. For those living and working in the global north, where exhibitions are an integral part of the creative economy, research funding, grants, awards, and philanthropy are common practice. For those living in parts of the world where support is scarce, participation is almost impossible. This year, for the first time in the history of the Biennale, those living in inverted commas, other parts of the world are the majority. To include those who have historically been excluded requires resources, financial, material, and labor. Typically, only large firms and institutions have the capacity to carry the load. For smaller 1- or 2-person firms, such as those in the Laboratory of the Future, without additional manpower, institutional funding, or state support, never mind the bureaucratic hurdles that must be negotiated to obtain visas to travel to Venice, the lift is simply too heavy. Throughout the exhibition, the contrast between participants from countries with generational means and those without is stark. This does not imply that individual participants, regardless of their origins, have not overcome significant hurdles in order to be there. On the contrary, for every participant from cultures of plenty, there are those who have spent as much time fundraising as designing. Yet the inequities persist and must be overcome one way or another. Fortunately, several large institutional donors stepped in where individual societies or governments did not or could not. Their support facilitated the changes that we all claim we wish to see. Systemic resource inequity requires systemic change. From the burden of proof required to obtain a 5-day Schengen visa, to the costs of transportation or using software which is priced not for the global north, but for the entire globe. Individuals aside, what the participants in this Biennale have managed to show is that equal economic opportunity is rightly and inevitably the basis for the future of any discipline, particularly the creative arts. Individuals have no control over the measure in which talent manifests in one person and not in another. But individuals, through the state, control the circumstances in which creativity flourishes. The all-important task of state and institutional support cannot be left to philanthropists or the free market to provide and resolve. The group of emerging African and diasporan practitioners participating under the title Guests from the Future must one day become hosts. Their presence at the table cannot be left to chance or charity. It is to them that this Biennale is dedicated, in the hope that the changes that we have all longed for so stubbornly, tenaciously, and ambitiously are here to stay.
Why is it the case that these are times of heightened curiosity and experimentation? This is the case because many, at least in South Africa and the rest of the continent, feel that our encounters with the world can no longer be explained by orthodox thinking. Many believe that conditions compel us to experiment with different images of thought and to create, hopefully, new concepts that will help us imagine a different existence in common.
A different existence in common. What is the point of an exhibition like the Biennale, and how does it help us imagine a different existence in common? These are complex questions without easy or singular answers. And the truth of the matter is this: I don't know. When I was offered the job, two things immediately came to mind. One, that my father would have been so proud, and two, that I did not possess the financial or institutional resources to do the job. Both are true, I think, and the experience of the past 18 months has swung wildly between these two poles, pride and despair. A few days ago, I received this message from a young Ghanaian British architect, Nana Ofosubiama. I put it up not to pat myself on the back, and believe me, my back is full of bullet holes, not pats. But because there are two sentences in it that speak to the complexity of this entire enterprise, of which the Biennale is a part, and the AFI is a part, and all of you are a part. What the future is, and what is possible if you can imagine it and work for it. I cannot overemphasize how important those last two words are: imagination and work. The Biennale was hard. More than anything, it was hard work. Graft, mindless administration, logistics, fundraising, more mindless administration, 18-hour days, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The project broke team members in ways that were entirely predictable and yet entirely unpredictable, and it broke me. It will take me the better part of a year to recover, so I say this in the nicest way possible. For everybody who wants a bit of my time, my input, my advice, my guidance, my support, my feedback, referrals, and references, you will unfortunately have to wait, and I thank you in advance for your understanding. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, this will be the last AFI event for a while, possibly even forever. This is not to say that the AFI will disappear, but rather that it will take a different form. State and local architectural institutional support has been non-existent. It is simply not possible to build a school or an institute under those conditions. But that is not the whole story of architectural education, and it never was. The most influential schools of architecture over the past 100 years have always come from the outside state, professional, and even traditional academic circles. I believe deeply that there is a role for an initiative that is not an institute per se, but a collection of initiatives. A nomadic studio, a publishing house, an exhibition center, a series of directories, a resource, in other words, a platform. AFI platform, or AF platform, we will drop the I, is already underway. The writer Ernest Hemingway had a neat little trick of finishing the day's writing in the middle of a sentence, which he said allowed him to easily pick up the threads of the story the following morning. I am leaving tonight's talk in the middle of a sentence. The AFI will now be ... so that I can pick it up again after my period of recovery with as much enthusiasm, ambition, and appetite as I started it 3 years ago. I'm going to leave you this evening with one of my favorite videos, Spirit, which embodies everything I hope the contemporary African and diasporan architectural spirit will be. Dynamic, creative, ambitious, traditional, modern, futuristic, hopeful, critical, global, spiritual, essential, and more. Thank you.